David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I know I told you this last week, but once again, the Dow Jones has crashed what is now another 2019 record, this time just over 800 points yesterday. It wasn't just the Dow crashing more than 3%. The NASDAQ fell more than 3%. The S&P 500 fell more than 3%. And it is starting to get very, very ugly in real terms. Personally, although this doesn't matter, I looked at my mutual fund account last night, something I don't do that often, and it was ugly, very, very ugly. I recommend most of you stay away from those accounts if you have them as well. But the economic implications are, of course, much more important and drastic than the personal implications. And when we look at the effect or the non-effect of the federal funds rate cut that we saw from the Federal Reserve, when we see the continued impact of Donald Trump's trade war, when we see continued instability in the bond markets, every day we are getting a little bit closer to saying we are now in a recession rather than getting closer and closer to one. And meanwhile, maybe most disturbingly, because economic downturns are part of the status quo, but usually we want to feel good about the person at the top at least understanding what's going on, if not necessarily being able to do anything about it. Trump, meanwhile, is pretending like his economic policies make sense, that everything's fine. Unless, of course, it isn't fine, in which case it's definitely not his fault. It's everybody else's fault. It's Democrats, it's Obama, it's the Federal Reserve because they didn't do a big enough federal funds rate cut. His trade war against China, oh, that's very good. That's definitely not the reason for economic instability, farmers going out of business or anything like that. And Trump now personally attacking Fed Chairman Jay Powell as clueless, when it's, of course, Donald Trump who has no idea what's going on. Take a look at this. Trump saying, quote, "We are winning big time against China." I mean, that's just not true. "Companies and jobs are fleeing. They're fleeing the United States. Prices to us have not gone up and in some cases have come down. China is not our problem, though Hong Kong is not helping. Our problem is with the Fed. Raised too much and too fast, now too slow to cut. Spread is way too much as other countries say thank you to clueless Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve. Germany and many others are playing the game. Crazy inverted yield curve. We should easily be reaping big rewards and gains, but the Fed is holding us back. We will win." Even if you believed this story, which is a completely unbelievable story, who nominated so-called clueless Jay Powell to the Federal Reserve? Oh, right, it was Donald Trump himself, but personal responsibility obviously not happening. And this may actually be a real problem for Trump. Obviously, a recession is a problem, period. And I don't want one, regardless of the political implications. Some Republicans are saying, you lefties are hoping for a recession to remove Trump. No, we have more than enough evidence to remove Trump, to warrant removing Trump already. We don't actually need a recession, and I'm not hoping for one. But remember that Donald Trump's rich friends were all counting on Trump at least boosting the stock market so that they could make a ton of money while lowering their tax rates. The stock market is back down to where it was about a year and a half ago, and it could continue to look very ugly for the next year, for the next many years. Are those Trumpists going to keep funneling cash to Trump's campaign if Trump loses the stock market gains and actually delivers losses? You almost can't really even have an economic discussion during the Trump administration because you have a completely reckless, clueless, petulant child with no understanding of economics or trade policy or financial policy, sort of feeling around in the dark and making major policy announcements via Twitter while blaming everyone but himself for what's going on. I want Donald Trump to lose in a landslide in 2020. I don't want it to happen because of a ruined economy. That's bad for everyone. No matter what I want, though, it might be what we end up with at the rate that things are going. And once again, we may end up with a terrible stock market during a Republican president, a sensible recovery under the next Democratic administration, which Republicans will pretend doesn't exist, followed by Republicans saying it was really Republicans that caused the recovery. Rinse, repeat like Bush, Obama, and as we've seen many times in the past. It doesn't look good, and it is actually starting to affect Donald Trump's approval rating. Let's talk about that next. Donald Trump's disapproval has exploded in the last 2 weeks. And there seem to be two big factors. Number one, Trump's just tragically, historically disastrous response to the recent mass shootings. And then in addition to that, you've got the continued recession fears and stock market crashes, 800 points lost on the Dow yesterday, more than a 3% decline there and on the NASDAQ and on the S&P 500. And Donald Trump just continues to tweet nonsense about the economy and about trade and about who's to blame. And the most amazing thing about all of this is that a Fox News poll finds that Trump is really not doing well. Fox just released a presidential approval poll, which has Trump at 56% disapproval. Now, before I go any further, it's shocking that it's only 56%. In other words, the fact that only 56% of the country disapproves of the job Trump is doing is a real red flag about tens of millions of people in our country. But needless to say, this has now basically tied the record for the highest Trump disapproval. The point here is the trend line. Trump's disapproval is up 5 full points from last month. And again, it's back to essentially statistically matching the record high disapproval Trump has had during his presidency, which was October of 2017, nearly 2 years ago. And the timing of this from an electoral perspective could be good as we start to get into the 2020 election in full. And meanwhile, Donald Trump continues to do nothing substantive about economic policy, obviously, because he doesn't understand it. He continues to do nothing substantive about the gun violence issues in the United States. And the same Fox News poll found that 2/3 of Americans, this is a significant majority in such a hyper-partisan environment, 2/3 of Americans want a ban on assault rifles and semi-automatic weapons. This is up 7 points over the last 15 or so months. This is a very important change. We already knew background checks were popular. The Fox News poll finds that there is 90% support for universal background checks, criminal background checks on every gun purchase and sale. However, it is across party lines. 90% of Democrats want universal background checks. 90% of Republicans want universal background checks. This is not common in the United States. So listen, it's clear why Trump's approval is dropping. You have mass violence events. When Barack Obama presided over mass violence events, he would empathize with the victims in a genuine way. It's not that much to ask for, but he did it. Donald Trump attacks political opponents, doubles down on bad ideas, takes smiling thumbs up pictures with a baby just orphaned by the mass shooting. So it makes sense. But even still, even though the trend line is going towards disapproval, how does 40% of the country still approve of the job this man is doing? How does nearly 1/3 of the country think that Donald Trump's actions are pulling the country together when the obvious reality is the opposite of that? How clueless do you have to be to look at what's going on and come away with that opinion? So at the micro level, can we just pass background checks? I mean, 90% of the country wants them. Can we just get it done? At the macro level, we see all of this data. We see Trump's disapproval climbing. We see Trump's polling underwater in a bunch of swing states for the 2020 election. Bernie, Biden, Warren, all polling ahead of Trump in hypothetical matchups. But are we going to remove him or are we going to blow it? That's my question. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. And make sure you are getting my live streams on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, today's two new members of the day are Daniel Gray and Mariah Codes. Daniel and Mariah, thank you. I really appreciate your support. Membership is and continues to be the #1 funding source for the show. Any other platforms take a higher cut of your contributions than membership. With membership, we pay just 2.9%. That's what we pay for payment processing. We keep all of the rest of the money. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about membership more than any of the other ways to support us. Someone who's been a supporter for almost 5 years now is David Deep, who has been with us since the end of 2014, early 2015. Amazing that we've had supporters for this long. Join Daniel, Mariah, and David at www.joinpacman.com. Coupon code available. This is 2020. You don't have to use it, but it is available. And either way, your support is very much appreciated. The David Pakman Show subreddit now has nearly 14,000 subscribers. This is a great place for people to talk amongst themselves about politics, to suggest ideas for the show. We have one of the largest independent progressive media subreddits, and it is increasingly active with a lot of good stuff and stuff I don't agree with, which is totally fine. One post I noticed this morning is a post from someone named Everybody Loves Crayon saying David needs to stop with the shtick that candidates like Warren and Bernie aren't far left. In the context of modern American politics, they are. Maybe they aren't far left when compared to David's personal views, but they are in modern American politics. David loses credibility with people like me on the right when he says stuff like this. You can't just compare them to other countries. In Nordic countries, they're not far left. So what? We're not a Nordic country or any other non-American country. This is a very typical right-wing view, which is, as he says, we're not any non-American country. We're America. Therefore, everything has to be evaluated solely in the context of what is normal in America. That's a loser's game. And the person says, I lose, they're on the right. I lose credibility with them when I say Bernie and Warren are not far right. I would lose quote, credibility with you for something else. You're not the person that I need to maintain credibility with. You have a very narrow American-centric view merely because you live in the United States. Understand that the world is more than the United States. I'm trying to present a perspective on this channel, on my show, that tells us just because your U.S.-based blinders give you one impression doesn't mean that when you expand your horizons, you realize the very different political reality of the world. So that's why the whole point here is to say, yeah, we have a very skewed view in the United States of what is considered far left. When you look at any other developed rich country like ours, anywhere in the world, they have a healthcare system that makes sense. They deal with gun control in a way that makes more sense, et cetera. So I completely reject what it is that you're saying here. And if I've lost credibility with you because I'm telling you the reality that in the United States, you have an Overton window that is far to the right of where it should be, given what other countries are doing and have achieved, then I'm sorry. I guess I'm not credible on that basis. Another post from the subreddit, a very interesting article on Huffington Post, which encourages Beto O'Rourke to pick a race that he can win. This is exactly what I have been saying for a couple of months now. Beto O'Rourke in the first Democratic debate imploded. He lost any chance he had to be the Democratic nominee. Doesn't mean he's a bad guy, and it certainly doesn't mean that I wouldn't love to see Beto replace a senator in Texas. He failed to do so with Ted Cruz in 2018, but maybe he could do it with John Cornyn in 2020. And I said it, 6-8 weeks ago, Beto should abandon the presidential campaign, go back to Texas, and use his national recognition to run against John Cornyn. There are now more and more op-eds that are suggesting he do exactly that. I love it. He should do it. He's got no shot to win the Democratic nomination. Some people I know will write in and say, David, he has no shot to defeat John Cornyn. He can get in the way of John Cornyn in a very significant way, causing Republicans in Texas and nationally to have to spend a ton of money to defend that seat. It will weaken Texas for Republicans if Beto simply does as well as he did against Ted Cruz. And I actually think he could win. It would be a fight, but I think that he could win. So really glad that people on the subreddit are pointing to that. Join the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit. That's REDDIT. I think before we know it, we're going to have 15,000 subreddit subscribers there. Very exciting stuff. We had a very special moment in right-wing propaganda yesterday. Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson both had clips that are top entries into dumbest take of the day. I'm going to play both of the clips for you. I want you to decide which is the dumber take of the two videos I'm going to play for you today. We have Exhibit A. Exhibit A is a clip from the Tucker Carlson program on Fox News, interviewing, I guess he still is considered comedian Adam Carolla. And they talk about political correctness around gendering people. And I actually can't tell if the clip is comedy or political commentary. It's either really unfunny comedy or really stupid political commentary. That's clip number one. Now, on a normal day, that clip, which I'll show you in a second, would be the dumbest take of the day from right-wing media. But then in comes Ben Shapiro, who claimed that anyone who has a second job simply has failed themselves. It's poor people's fault that their one job doesn't pay enough and that they need a second job, and it's their fault. So we have a competition here for dumbest clip of the day yesterday. First, Tucker and Adam. Take a look.
And I would say drop them off at a business and let them be what they used to call me on the construction site, start off as a glorified goomper, which is low man on the totem pole. Ooh, can we say low man anymore? No. Low. What? Well, I don't want to use a pejorative here and assign.
I don't know the answer, but
gender.
I know the pronoun is they. That's all I know.
Low they. Not on the totem pole, because that's cultural appropriation.
Good point.
Low they on the barber pole.
No.
Low they on the flagpole?
No, definitely not on the flagpole, on the utility pole.
Low they on the telephone pole.
Yeah.
So the premise here is, isn't college a scam? And then they're getting into, are you allowed to say low man on the totem pole because everyone on the left and everyone in colleges is so politically correct? Again, is this comedy? If so, it's just not funny. Is this political commentary? If so, it's really stupid. So that's option A, all right? Let's now look at option B for dumbest take of the day from yesterday. Here's Ben Shapiro on people who have jobs that don't pay well and on people who have two jobs.
Well, the fact is that if you had to work more than one job to have a roof over your head or food on the table, you probably shouldn't have taken the job that's not paying you enough. That'd be a you problem. Also, it is not true that the vast majority of people in the United States are working two jobs. It just is not true. According to the census statistics, a small but steady number of American workers have more than one job because either they need extra income or because they want to gain more experience or explore different interests. There's a recently released U.S. Census Bureau report, and apparently what it found is that approximately 8.3%, this is as of 2013, so it's actually lower now, 8.3% of workers had more than one job. That was as of 2013. It's a lot lower now. So this notion that there are just tons and tons of people who are working multiple jobs, it is not really true. It's not actually the reality. In May, 5% of Americans had multiple jobs. 5%. That's really what's bringing down the unemployment rate, is those 5% of workers who have multiple jobs. Okay, for all of the talk about people working at Uber, it's held to that range actually really since 2009. It's always been a very, very low number. So this, again, is just a lie. It is also this bizarre idiocy that you can dictate to the economy what the economy ought to do. Every time everybody tries to dictate to the economy what it ought to do, the economy fights back because it turns out the aggregate knowledge of the market economy knows more than you do. I know, shocking.
How is it an individual person's job that, or said a different way, because I don't want to use the term job in both cases. How is it an individual person's fault that most jobs don't pay that well in the bottom half of the economy and that wages have been stagnant for the bottom half of workers for decades? Ben is right about one thing. The number of people actually working two jobs is pretty small, but it's still bigger than he wants to admit. I mean, 5% is still 1 out of 20. If you go to the supermarket and there are, 100 people there, 5 of those people are likely working two jobs. That's not nothing, okay? But it's not huge. I will give him that. But the really dumb part of it is if you had to work more than one job, it's your fault that your main job doesn't pay enough, even though you have no control over the distribution of jobs and the wages that are available in the economy. If there are only so many jobs that pay well, you can't control that, right? This is actually the epitome of that cartoonish, childish libertarian idea that a 16-year-old hears about Ayn Rand, reads one book, and now believes this, even though they don't really understand anything about how the economy or the world works, combined with the sort of abject cruelty of modern conservatism. It's the kind of delusional worship of free markets and liberty that these people fall into, typically before they know anything. Ben Shapiro comes from a relatively, upper middle class family, thinks that even if he didn't, he would still have found a good job, period, simply because he's determined to do it. The idea that you might have to choose from the available jobs, even if it's a job that doesn't pay well, or even if it's two jobs that don't pay well, because you've got to pay your bills and you have no parents to bail you out, that doesn't even enter into Ben Shapiro's mind. I actually don't think he's being disingenuous here. I think this is a combination of his personal privileged position in society, combined with cartoonish right-wing economic ideas, combined with a complete lack of empathy. I think that that's what it is. I don't believe he's being deliberately disingenuous. I think he's just clueless and somehow hasn't gotten out of those childish libertarian ideas that 16-year-olds often pick up and then lose by the time they get to college and learn how the world actually works. This is what I call right-wing politics brought to you by a privileged upbringing and a complete lack of empathy. That's how you get to this. So my question to you is, which is the worst take? Is it Tucker Carlson and Adam Carolla, or is it Ben Shapiro? I think that the Tucker one is more cartoonishly stupid, but the Ben Shapiro one is more dangerous because it represents a common American conservative worldview that's completely disconnected from reality. And it gets people supporting bad policy. It gets people seeing the world in a way that is totally unrealistic and thinking that really bad ideas are actually really good ideas. So I think if I had to vote, cartoonishly stupid, Adam Carolla. Again, I don't have to get back into it. Dangerous when it comes to actually making political progress in this country, Ben Shapiro and the ideas that he puts out there, particularly because he puts them out there by talking really quickly and confidently, as we've analyzed before, in a way that people hear it and they're just overwhelmed by what seems like just crystal clear and perfect logic. Let me know what you think, and make sure that you are following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. While you're there, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. We'll take a quick break. We'll take a quick break. A lot more coming up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Michael Lynch, who's the director of the Humanities Institute, a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, also author of the new book, Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. Michael, so great to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is such an interesting topic to me, the idea of the sort of combination of a much longer period of pseudo and anti-intellectualism, which has sort of combined with or crashed with this intellectual arrogance trend that we're seeing partially because of the internet and social media. Can you first just talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that internet and social media have made people intellectually arrogant?
Well, when we talk about, first of all, when we talk about intellectual arrogance, what I mean is the idea of being resistant to improving your worldview by appeal to evidence or to the experience of other people. It's the idea that, you know it all, and that your worldview is, at least with some respects, unimprovable. And I think there are pretty obvious ways that all of us are really intimately familiar with, in which the internet and the ways in which we use the internet can reinforce and encourage this attitude. I mean, for one thing, no matter what your opinion you may have on any topic, you can Google and get some confirmation for that opinion from some corner of the internet, dark or not. And in a way, right now, it used to be that seeing was believing, we'd say, but now Googling is believing. And therefore, getting information in that way, the sort of weird paradoxical fact is that our ability to get information in that way so easily, right at our fingertips, is also not just making us, in a sense, feel more knowledgeable, but feel that we are always right, because of the ability to confirm our biases. I mean, add one other element to that, which is that the internet is a personalized information-seeking device, as it were, a set of devices and platforms. Everything that we encounter on the internet, from the news that comes down our Facebook feed to the ads that we see on the pages we visit, are all personalized. And of course, that's great when we're shopping for books or shoes or what have you. It's not so great when we're shopping for facts, because if you're just getting the facts that confirm your pre-existing prejudices, that's a short road to type of epistemic disaster.
Yeah, there are some elements to the social media platforms, the way you're talking about algorithmically and otherwise, which sort of encourage or perpetuate a sort of reasoning from emotion and style rather than facts. But beyond that, is there something about social media and the internet that just beyond the algorithms does encourage people to be arguing more from emotion rather than from fact?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that one of the things that we, besides the sort of algorithms and the personalization, one of the things that I think is really motivating this rise that we see in a type of arrogance, and including what I would call a type of tribal arrogance, is that we're often unaware of how we're communicating on social media. We're sort of, in a sense, blind to the real nature of our communicative acts. Here's an example. When we all share something online that's a news story, whether it's fake or otherwise, when we share some piece of news content, from The Guardian or from this show or what have you, you think of yourself as, at least I do, as like sharing some piece of, factual information, or at least saying, here's some interesting opinion that you should probably pay attention to. And I'm saying that to my friends or followers.
Yeah.
So it looks like I'm engaging in sort of the game of, giving reasons and so forth. But really, it seems like we might be doing something else. So one reason to think that is because a lot of data is coming out right now that show that something that we probably all intuitively know, which is that almost no one that shares things online reads what they share. And what that suggests something. It suggests that we're doing something else. We're communicating in some other way. And what I think we're often doing is what we're doing is signaling that, well, we're a member of a particular tribe or group. We're saying we're on this team. And we're communicating, in other words, a sort of emotional feeling. Or perhaps we're communicating a sense of outrage. And of course, the platforms are hardwired to encourage this sort of thing. The sorts of the treats, again, things that most of people listening here are going to know, is that the more sort of emotional language you include in your tweet or your post, the more sort of language of outrage you include, the higher the likelihood that will be reposted, reshared, or retweeted. And that fact alone suggests that the whole economy of social media is encouraging us to engage in this sort of expression of sentiment, as David Hume, the philosopher, would have called it, or emotion. And the fact that we're not aware that we're actually doing that makes us really easy marks.
Yeah, well, this starts to dovetail with findings from such varied academic disciplines as what Jonathan Haidt has written about in moral psychology,
exactly.
What Daniel Kahneman has written about in behavioral economics, that in many times we believe that we have come to our conclusions based on the evidence, when in reality we've often come to our conclusions for other reasons. Haidt would say it relates to our moral values that resonate more with us. Daniel Kahneman would have more of a logistical, practical behavioral economics approach, but that we are first coming to our conclusions, then finding information to justify them. And that's where I think social media has really scaled up this mechanism.
Yeah, it's definitely a device, a mechanism, as you just said, to fuel confirmation bias. I mean, there's been a lot of research, as most of the listeners will probably know, about the sort of bubbles, the information and epistemic bubbles that we live in. That is fueled by the personalization we talked about, and also encouraged by the hard wiring of the platforms, as I was talking about them, to encourage the emotional exchange over informational exchange. I mean, I think what we're finding is that both the economy of social media and our psychology, our human psychology, are just working together and forming a sort of toxic mix that's increasing this type of arrogance that we're talking about. Of course, you have to add to that politics, ideology. Right now in our country, there are ideologies that are starting to celebrate the idea that facts and reason and the experts and science celebrate that those things should not be listened to, and that you should trust your gut, and that you should trust your tribe, and that it's the tribe that gives power, and it's not and we're not answerable to the facts. That ideology, together with the psychology that we were just talking about, and the technology, that's a real toxic mix, and it's really leading to what I'm calling the know-it-all society.
So that's what I wanted to talk about next, which is what do we know empirically or quantitatively about the partisan divide on some of these phenomena? Because, for example, there are many reports which say, if you look back at the 2016 election, the amount of actual fake news, not using the definition of the current president, but actual just straight fake news that was shared was significantly higher by conservatives than by liberals, as one example of showing that this phenomena is not sort of taking root equally across partisanship. What can you add to our understanding of the partisan element to this sort of cultural element that you've identified, the know-it-all society?
Okay, well, when we think about polarization, so let's step back a little bit and think about what, common topic of conversation in conversations like this, which is that, we're polarized. Recent data, for example, from Pew suggests that on a range of issues, on actual issues, if you poll people who are both conservative-leaning, conservative, liberal-leaning, liberal, you find surprisingly, while of course Americans are strongly divided on a whole number of issues, there's actually much more agreement than you might antecedently think.
Yes.
At the same time, there is increasingly a dramatic increase in polarization of what we might call affective polarization or group polarization. That is, we are more and more prone to describe the people on the other side of the aisle as distrustful, as untrustworthy, as immoral, as ignorant, and we increasingly know that the other side describes us, whoever the us is, in the same way, and we resent them for it. So the first thing I think to keep in mind is that there's a growing awareness that we are sort of polarized in this way, and there's a strong resentment and antagonism that's being fueled precisely from that awareness. Now, to get back to your question about how these different ideologies, both on the left and the right, respond or react to that, I think in very different ways. There's no doubt right now, at least in my mind, that many of the ideologies on the right, particularly ideologies that are driven by nationalism and white nationalism in particular, are ideologies that are self-consciously celebrating a rejection of what we might have called rational authority. That's part of what's fueling some of the enthusiasm, I think, that we see from particular advocates of that ideology online. The thought is, and we see it, I think, and indeed by the inhabitant of the White House. I mean, if you want to talk about arrogance, it seems like exhibit number one, of course, is Donald Trump, a man who, after all, has been known to say that he's the humblest person that he knows. Look, I think it's not. I think it is a surprise to most of your listeners that white nationalism is a view according to which whites are superior. Whites intrinsically know more, are better people. That sort of nonsense. That's clearly an attitude that is symbolized by or embodies this type of arrogance that I've been discussing. And I think that the degree to which that continues to be propagated is the degree to which we're going to see an increasing sort of affective polarization that we were talking about before. On the other hand, I also want to point out that, look, it's if you want to look up intellectually arrogant in the dictionary, you're probably going to find a picture of a face very much like mine. I mean, I'm a white male liberal progressive college professor. To a lot of people in the country, I embody intellectual arrogance, and I imagine some of the people listening have probably been thinking that. Fair enough. I think it's important that progressives realize that we are not immune to implicit bias. We are not immune to the sort of problems that are inherent in human psychology that afflict the rest of mankind, so to speak. Progressives, I think and I have been guilty of this, and some of your listeners might think I've been guilty of this already, is that you can fall into thinking that, conservatives, they're all like, they all fall into the same buckets. They all are the ones that have prejudice and bias, and we are the tribe of reason and rationality, and we are free of those things. That's a mistake. It is falling into the same type of tribal arrogance that I, for one, am trying to combat.
So I will somewhat frequently get phone calls from viewers who will say, hey, David, a couple years ago, I fell into an alt-right sort of echo chamber. I was watching some gaming thing on YouTube, which led me to Stefan Molyneux and then Ben Shapiro. And they describe the path in, and they say I bought into it completely. And then the algorithm showed me a left-wing gamer, which brought me to you and to, they'll name other people that do what I do. And now I'm out. I've sort of been deprogrammed from that. And of course, my initial reaction is, okay, the outcome is a good one as far as I see it. But is there not a bigger problem here that merely by clicking around on YouTube, you were first pulled to the extreme right, and then merely by chance you became pushed to the extreme left? I hear the way too malleable nature of so many people's thinking. And I'm curious what your reaction is to those stories of radicalization and de-radicalization, which, even if we like the way that the outcome went, to me signal a sort of problematic, deeper problem.
That's a really interesting point. Like you, of course, I celebrate people becoming de-radicalized,
yes,
particularly from violent nationalist ideologies. But I also agree that what that sort of anecdote or story illustrates is the passiveness by which the passive way in which most of us seem to know nowadays. Much of what we know, we Google now, as I was talking about earlier. That's how most people today receive most of their information. And while, again, that can be really super useful. I Google know all day, every day. It's also, I think, changing the way we interface with information and how we critically evaluate it. I think that one of the things that I talk about in the book is some lessons from some very ancient philosophical figures, including going back all the way to Socrates. Socrates, one of the things that's really interesting about the lessons you can glean from the end of his life is that he was somebody who was interested in questioning both authority and himself. He said, well, one of the things that the only thing I really can say I know is that I don't know very much. And he was keen, of course, to sort of bring down the people who claim that they know quite a bit about things. And he took some pleasure, clearly, in getting them to admit that they didn't know as much as they did. And that's great. But he also wanted us to focus on our own attitudes. And he thought that in order to do that, you needed to get outside on the street, literally, and start talking to people, to start having conversations. I think there's something to be said with that attitude, not so much as that you can't talk to people online like we're doing right now. That's perfectly, I think, Socratic. What Socrates, I think, was really pushing us there was to think of ourselves not as passive, just suckers of information, but as active inquirers, people who get out and try to, read, engage, talk to one another, and question assumptions. And as I said, continue to question yourself and your own biases and prejudices that you might not have been aware that you actually have.
Very, very good advice for sure. And if only it was taking place, if only it was easier to make that the reality based on how a lot of these online platforms are deliberately configured to really generate the opposite. We've been speaking with Michael Lynch, who's author of the new book, Know-It-All Society, Truth and Arrogance in Political Culture. Michael, really a pleasure having you on today.
Thanks so much. It was great.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the most disgusting Republican members of the House right now is Steve King. I'm not going to go through his full repulsive credentials for you, but they include everything from coddling and excusing white nationalism, extreme religious hysteria. Even many Republican organizations have condemned Steve King as the disgusting racist that he is. Steve King once spoke about being upset that white nationalist is now considered offensive. He once told Breitbart News that he doesn't want Muslims working in meatpacking plants because, quote, I don't want people doing my pork that won't eat it, let alone hope I go to hell for eating pork chops. He equated the torture and prisoner abuse of the Abu Ghraib prison to, quote, hazing. And he subscribes to this white genocide conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement, which we've talked about a few times now, but I won't go into detail about now. So anyway, needless to say, this is a horrible, horrible person. He now is saying that we should credit rape and incest for the existence of humanity. That, in a sense, if it were not for rape and incest, because it apparently is very common in his mind, it would be destructive to humanity, and therefore maybe rape and incest aren't that bad, and thus there should be no such exceptions for rape and incest when you talk about abortion law. When I saw the headline, part of me didn't want to believe it, even if it was Steve King. Even for Steve King, it sounded a little bit too much. I don't want to speak for Steve King, so here he is yesterday in Urbandale, Iowa. This is out of his own mouth.
What if it was okay, and what if we went back through all the family trees and just pulled those people out that were products of rape and incest? Would there be any population of the world left if we did that? Considering all the wars and all the rape and pillage that's taken place and whatever happened in culture after society, I know I can't certify that I'm not part of a product of that.
So I guess the argument is we should not have rape and incest exceptions for abortion bans, because if we did, humanity wouldn't exist, because rape and incest have been so prominent in the perpetuation of Homo sapiens around the world. Is Steve King feeling like with Donald Trump in the White House, he's no longer getting attention for saying really dumb things? Like, is he realizing that there's someone actually more repugnant and reprehensible who's getting a lot of attention for the things he says, and he wants some of that attention back to Trump? I read a funny comment, something like, Steve King is from Iowa. He mostly knows people who are the products of rape and incest, and that's why he thinks that without rape and incest, there'd be no humanity. I read that on the internet, but that would be a distasteful joke to make, so I'm not going to make it today. Steve King also suggested during the same speech in Urbandale, Iowa, that there's a plot to remove him from power. And I want to talk about that because the way Steve King presents it, there's some kind of conspiracy or subterfuge to remove him from his seat in the House of Representatives. I call it something else. I call it he has an opponent. And there is actually really good news. The opponent is our friend JD Scholten, who is running again against Steve King. You can support JD. You can maybe vote for JD if you live in Iowa's 4th District. So we met JD Scholten back in 2018. August of 2018, I went to Netroots Nation in New Orleans, Louisiana, interviewed a few different 2018 candidates. One of them was JD Scholten. JD Scholten is actually a political outsider with really good ideas. He's a progressive. He recognizes the horrible nature of Steve King. I tweeted with him a few weeks ago and said, hey, are you running again in 2020? Because it would really be great to remove Steve King. And he said at the time he wasn't sure. He has since announced that he is running again. So we're going to try to get JD Scholten on the show and talk to him. He lost by only 10,000 votes to Steve King in 2018. This is a significantly red-leaning district, Iowa's 4th District. And JD Scholten came within 10,000 votes, just 3 percentage points separating them. Steve King could lose to JD Scholten in 2020. I hope you'll check out JD Scholten's campaign, contribute if that's the way you want to activate, work to get out the vote. Vote in that election if you live in Iowa's 4th District, but we'll definitely be talking about that one more. As much as we would have loved to see Ted Cruz be removed by Beto O'Rourke in 2018, I would love to see JD Scholten remove disgusting bottom feeder Steve King in 2020, and we're going to do what we can to make that happen. There's this former Republican congressman named Joe Walsh. He's really a disgusting guy, much like Steve King. Big Tea Party guy is Joe Walsh when he was in Congress. Used to have a radio show where he would say horribly inflammatory things. He is now apologizing for his role in helping to get Donald Trump elected in 2016. He wrote a New York Times op-ed yesterday where he said, quote, "In Mr. Trump, I see the worst and ugliest iteration of views I expressed for the better part of a decade. To be sure, I've had my share of controversy. On more than one occasion, I questioned Mr. Obama's truthfulness about his religion. At times, I expressed hate for my political opponents. We now see where this can lead. There's no place in our politics for personal attacks like that, and I regret making them." So, okay, I mean, this is good. Walsh is realizing how destructive and terrible Trump has been. He's realizing how destructive and terrible some of the things he did, which are similar to the personal type attacks that Donald Trump makes, how terrible those were. But he didn't just help elect Donald Trump. This guy's entire moral compass is completely backwards. He once tweeted, "If Trump loses, I'm grabbing my musket." That's not a personal attack. That's actually a threat of violence, a specific threat of violence from a prominent Republican. He said on Twitter, quote, "I'll just say it, Sandy Hook parents, your 15 minutes is up," against, I guess, gun safety activists coming out of the Sandy Hook shooting, and who even knows what he meant by that. I could give you a really long list, but the point is, this guy wasn't just a supporter of Trump in 2016, and he regrets supporting Trump because Trump has been bad or something like that. He was supporting Trump in the most toxic and destructive way possible, while simultaneously being a completely deplorable right-winger. So, okay, it's good that he changed his mind about Trump. His point, I guess, is to encourage a primary challenge against Trump. He tweeted yesterday, quote, "Why did I write this piece? 2 reasons. First, I wanted to make clear that Donald Trump is unfit to be president, and he must be challenged in the Republican primary. And second, I wanted to apologize for the role I played in helping to put an unfit con man in the White House." So I've said before, it's a problem in our society when people become irredeemable. And we've actually, when we talk to former extremists, last week I interviewed former neo-Nazi Frank Mink. He said one of the things that helps get extremists out of their views is becoming redeemable, being redeemable, and being reaccepted by society when they attempt to right the wrongs and move out of their horrible extremist ideology. That lack of empathy is what often gets extremists into extreme views in the first place. And so it's really important that people don't become irredeemable to society. And I agree with that, right? I mean, we need people to be redeemable in order to encourage more people to reconsider their actions. At the same time, he's still a toxic Republican who doesn't like Trump and who was so ignorant or blinded by partisanship to a degree that I guess he didn't realize the extent of the damage that he was doing by supporting Donald Trump. Good for him. I mean, it's tough to own up to mistakes. If more people did it, we'd be better off as a society. But this doesn't change that Joe Walsh still would put elected officials in power who want terrible policy and who, if they are allowed to do what it is they want to do, would be hugely destructive in terms of the direction of the country. If it were up to Joe Walsh, we would have what? A slightly less insane, less toxic Republican as president? That's not what the left is looking for beyond the one point of agreement that Trump has to go. So let's give him credit where he deserves credit. It's tough to say I made a mistake. It's tough to do it publicly. That's great. At the same time, let's not pretend like now this guy is an ally of some kind whose political views align with ours. There's also another angle here. The idea being Republicans are simply realizing that Trump is a losing ticket. So it's not that they're abandoning Trump because they don't like Trump's style, tone, tenor, or way of doing business. they're trying to get themselves off of a sinking ship before it takes them down. So they're claiming that it's moral grounds that have them objecting to Donald Trump. But really, it's a lot of them think Trump will lose, in which case this is actually even less genuine than we believe it to be. Let me know what you think. I'm glad giving credit where credit is due. We just don't want to give more credit than what is actually due. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. This voicemail is warning me about something that may destine us for failure on Twitch. Is that a word, to destine us? I hope it is. The David Pakman Show has launched on Twitch. Twitch is primarily a live streaming platform. Twitch.tv/David Pakman. I've been doing a bunch of live streams there, taking audience questions, taking political tests, and doing all sorts of different sort of long form content that we don't typically do on the broadcast show. And one of the great ways to support us on Twitch is if you have an Amazon Prime account, Amazon lets you subscribe to us with something called Twitch Prime. It doesn't cost you anything because every Amazon Prime member gets a free Twitch Prime subscription every month, but it counts as a paid subscription for us. So that's really great. But here is a warning about that from someone who is savvy with Twitch. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, this is Todd calling. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up about Twitch Prime in that people need to subscribe to that every month. So after every 30 days, they'll have to go back onto Twitch and re-click that subscription button, whereas a regular paid subscription on Twitch Prime, not Twitch Prime, just on Twitch.
Yes.
Will just automatically renew.
That's
so
right.
Again, if you subscribe through Twitch Prime, you actually have to physically go through the process of clicking that subscribe button again in 30 days and every 30 days ongoing in order to remain a subscriber to the channel. All right. Thanks a lot. Great show.
Yep. So listen, I mean, I think this is, of course, by design. The idea of giving people a free Twitch Prime subscription is that they do it for a month and then they convert to a fully paid membership, which I would love for people to do on Twitch. But the reality is that a lot of people just want to support us with that Twitch Prime subscription. So this is something we need to figure out. Obviously, on streams that I continue to do, I can remind people, hey, check your Twitch Prime status. They expire automatically every 30 days. Please resubscribe. It still costs you nothing, but you've got to click that resubscribe button. But I'm open to hearing from people in the audience about the best way to do this, people more familiar with Twitch and who are on there. Potentially a great source of revenue for us, but this automatic expiring and having to manually renew, I think will be a challenge that we'll have to sort of figure out and overcome. I want to hear from you about that. In the meantime, follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. Hope you'll join a live stream there for totally different types of content than what we're doing on our other platforms. And I also hope to see you on the bonus show today. We will be talking about a bunch of different stuff, including Ohio State University wanting to trademark the word "the." We will talk about more than 200,000 people signing a petition to rename Trump Towers Street after Barack Obama, which is interesting, and also more research showing the promise of ecstasy, MDMA, as a treatment for PTSD. We've covered this before on the show, and I want to dig into it on today's bonus show. Become a viewer of the bonus show by becoming a member at joinpakman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.